the narrative is so important, right? So it isn't necessarily about lowering standards, which was mentioned earlier. I think it's more about saying, and we define diversity as diversity of thought, style, experience, and approach, right? You're really just trying to cast the widest net to get the best people into the organization. And two people may look exactly the same and bring entirely different experiences to the table. So I really think that narrative is really important. And then to pick up on Lucy's comment as well, if you don't mind, for us as part of our effort, and James I know as well at Oppenheimer, it's really critical to get that balance between diversity and inclusion right? So you can bring in all these diverse people, but as we all know, and I know many of you know this as well, if the culture doesn't support it, it's not going to work. So we've got to really make sure that at the same time as bringing in the diverse talent, developing the talent, we're also building that culture by educating our managers and our leaders on what it means to identify and build diverse teams and welcome people into the organization. I don't think diversity is an HR issue. I think, to your point, I fully agree with you. It's a business issue. And I think it's really important that we stress that. And I think it's unfortunate, frankly, when diversity and inclusion, sorry, I'll be the difficult one on the panel today, but when diversity functions sit kind of as standalone functions buried in HR, right? You've got to be part of the dialogue. You've got to be in the business, having these discussions and with your customers, as James mentioned. I think it's really critical. The other thing I just wanted to highlight, it's a fact that I find fascinating, and I know you'll know this very well, but this whole concept of the investor community focusing on these areas. I heard a statistic recently that 70% of all assets under management globally within the next two decades, and by the way, this is about 60 trillion US dollars, are going to be in the hands of millennials and women in the next 2 decades. So what does that tell us? That's a factoid we need to work with, and that means in general, by the way, women and millennials are more focused on social impact issues, and that means the financial community is going to change. The analysts need to understand this work. They need to understand diversity. They need to understand sustainability and how these all impact investor solutions. So I think getting back to the original question around the business case and the facts and the statistics, if you can walk around and actually integrate these statistics into the narrative, into the business case, I think you can make a really big impact. When a woman looks at a job description, on average, I'll say that again, if they will apply for the job, if they feel they meet 90% of the criteria, right? Men, 50 to 60%. So right there, you've got a data point that's fascinating, right? And so you've got to kind of get out there and say, listen, take a risk here. So how do you write that JD as well before you even get to the resume? And when you actually get to the conversation to encourage these women, in this case, to actually go for these roles. And I think that will also be helpful in terms of changing the dialogue, utilizing the technology as well. So cultural fluency is a very sort of common practice in diversity and inclusion these days. In fact, it's a pretty hot topic, right? The more global our companies are getting. I personally spent 5.5 years in Asia and spent a lot of time on this topic of educating our leaders on a global basis as to what those cultural differences were and how do you appreciate the leadership and the relational skills of the Eastern culture versus the Western culture. That's a personal perspective, which we can always elaborate on, but from a corporate perspective in terms of what we do in this is we see this all the time, and it is a real issue. And this happens particularly for us and perhaps my colleagues as well in developing markets, where we're seeing that we send all these expats out there. I was one of them. I was one of them who went out to Asia, to drive this culture change. And then you're not yet building the local leadership around that. So one very specific tool that we use is a whole concept around educating people about cultural fluency. And so there's a specific tool called Culture Wizard, if you may be familiar with it. It's one of the better ones out there, in my opinion, right? It's online, it's easy, it's simple to use, but if you debrief it properly, you can actually learn quite a bit from it. And the more you can kind of push that out to the community, that certainly helps raise awareness around what those differences are.